All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Alvarez. I am the project manager for our public health scholarship program under the Department of Urban Public Health at Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science. And so I'm so excited to be part of this effort of being able to provide professional development webinars. This is based off feedback that we get from our local community health partners as far as topics and themes that they're seeing on the day-to-day that they would love support with. And so this is called our Empowering Minds, Transforming Communities Professional Development webinar series. And so today we will be going over Beyond Managing Up, Leading Up by Design with Dr. William Shea, Bill Shea, and Dr. Susana Santos. And so I'm going to go ahead and briefly read their bios, and then I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Bill to go ahead and start us off. So welcome, you all. Continue introducing yourselves in the chat while I go, because we do want to know who is here with us. So one of our presenters today, Dr. Bill Shea, he holds a PhD in sociology and has worked for over 30 years in multiple public and private higher education institutions as a senior executive. At present, he serves as our Senior Associate Provost at Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science in South Los Angeles, with lead responsibility for academic personnel and academic program administration. Dr. Shea functions as a Chief Accreditation Officer, including serving as ALO to WSCUC since 2012, and he completed the 2015-2016 Assessment Leadership Academy with us. So thank you, Dr. Shea, for joining us today. We also have Dr. Susana Santos, who holds a PhD in higher education from Claremont Graduate University and has 12 plus years of progressive professional experience as a higher education administrator. Her areas of expertise include planning, managing, and supporting assessments, as well as working in data collection, coordination, and presentation to support institutional data production and reporting to internal programs and offices, as well as external organizations. So Dr. Santos is a graduate of the WSCUC Assessment Leadership Academy and was California Association for Institutional Research Team Fellow for the WSCUC 2020-2021 Fellowship Program. She serves as our present as Director of Institutional Research and Academic Effectiveness at Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science. And her years of experience have helped her to develop and support equitable and creative solutions to assess and address the needs of diverse community and student population. So we are so honored to have them here today to be presenting this webinar. And we will please, as they take over this presentation, feel free to use the chat to drop in any questions, and we'll definitely have plenty of time to go over that. So take it from here, Dr. Shea. You got this now.
Thank you. I'm going to start today by playing a brief video clip which really illustrates the application that we're going to explore in this session of how to use data, how to leverage data for managing up and leading up. And as the title of the talk already implies, we want to go beyond the model of managing up to talk about leading up, one being related to task-oriented work within a formal power structure, and the other based on affinity rather than authority in a social network structure. So let's just take a view of this little clip to start us out, because we're going to apply these concepts today to data as our object of interest.
If AI is the Wild West, does that make data the new gold? Huh.
So with that, it's just a little teaser meant to illustrate why this topic is so important today. And indeed, I first want to thank the Department of Urban Public Health for sponsoring this professional development series around empowering minds and transforming communities. And I also, of course, want to thank all of you for engaging in these kinds of professional development activities. So with that, what we have in mind for about 20 minutes, we'll be presenting a series of ideas that go over a conceptual framework, a practical toolkit, a case study to illustrate the application of that theory with the toolkit in mind. And then we're going to conclude with a little bit of Q&A on my part between Suzanne and I about what her experience has been as a unit leader of the Director of Institutional Research and Academic Effectiveness in working with the model that I've implemented for my team. So with that, we wanted to start with a picture of what our team looks like. And indeed, an org chart, a job description, a budget ledger, they are all the tangible indicators of what I'm going to call in a moment grid. That is the lines of formal authority that every organization has to map out one way or another. And in this particular instance, with data as the subject of inquiry, we're focusing on the Office of Institutional Research and Academic Effectiveness. Now, in channeling the quote of our famous namesake, Charles R. Drew, where excellence of performance will transcend artificial barriers created by man, we'll talk toward the end of our presentation today about misuse of data, misplacing data, and cautionary tales about managing or leading up with data. And indeed, the idea of managing up is encapsulated by this role relationship between myself and my boss, the provost, Sylvia Manning, myself and Susanna's unit in particular, which also includes an institutional analyst, Samuel Pendar. But every other name on this chart, and you'll hear us referring to them now and then, was fundamental to the approach we're developing of working within the unit, cross-functionally, on behalf of the interests of the university. And indeed, going into this academic year, I brokered a series of performance expectations. This is in my performance review for what I'm supposed to focus on this year. I put it in Susanna's performance review. Samuel's has it. Wendy has it. David has it. All of my direct reports under this idea of the grid, the formal authority, have this common objective to improve the way in which we compile information and present evidence for decision-making of senior management. So we're going to start today with a little vignette from the healthcare field. We're also going to end the presentation with some comments on where healthcare is headed in terms of data integrity, data impact, and data importance in terms of managing and leading up. This comes straight out of the literature. It's pretty simple to grasp that, if you're in the OR and if you're lower in the status hierarchy, the surgeons rule the OR in terms of operating procedure, if you will. But let's say a nurse or another, house staff member identifies a problem and calls that out on behalf of patient safety. This whole approach that Sandra Lee Smith is advocating from the nursing field in particular is to ensure that we create a culture that even if there are formal structures of authority and responsibility and accountability, that we create a culture in which those lower on the formal chain of authority feel like they are empowered and act in a way that's responsible in calling out potential problematic issues or behavior. So that's managing up through the official hierarchy with a culture that encourages others to speak up when someone's at risk. Secondly, same article, they talk about leading quietly. And what I like about this little vignette in the article, which references a book about the topic, is now we're talking about leading, not managing. And what we'll see in a moment with a brief review of the relevant literature is that leading is based on affinity rather than authority. It's based on who I like or not, who I want to work with or not. Sometimes that's dictated by the formal structure. Other times you might have a go-to colleague who's completely out of your structure. They might even be in another organization as a mentor. So what we're going to emphasize throughout, we have a cultural axis that's focused instead on group and relational activities. Again, for the same objective, in this case, to ensure the safety of patients. So why big data? And then we'll transition to the theory. I think all of us appreciate within the space of our lifetimes, there's been a a series of revolutions in data. It certainly started with the notion of information, as we'll see in a moment, coming out of World War II with creation of post-industrial society. But then the idea of information became even more refined. And earlier, digital systems weren't digital, they were analog. And now when we're in the digital age of zeros and ones being able to represent anything, that means that we were able to accelerate as a culture, as a society, as a planet, the amount of data created, captured, copied, and consumed. These are staggering figures. I didn't know what a zettabyte was until I looked it up. 1 trillion gigabytes. That's a lot of data. So by whatever metric we see, big data is the chief commodity of the current age. And I selected that vignette from the Salesforce pitch. There's several new commercials they're promoting. That's a customer relations management system, a CRM, and they're working with Matthew McConaughey, and there's several clever little videos like data being the new gold rush, especially around AI, which is going to be important in a few minutes in our talk. Now, I want to start with what is probably the most recognized data visualization that would be presented should you enroll in a course in data management and visualization. It's in the textbook. And what you'll learn throughout the course of our presentation, that data cannot speak for itself. It cannot make meaning. Only humans can make meaning. And indeed, we have data because we want to tell a story about how it is meaningful. That is how it relates to our work and how it promotes the success of our organizations. I can imagine all of us are familiar in some way or another, either through cinema or history, the Titanic disaster. And what we should appreciate is that even at the time, as that right chart shows in the newspapers, that it was quite clear that if you were a woman, you were much more likely to survive than a man. And if you were in first cabin class, close to the top of the ship, you were much more likely to survive than those in third class at the bottom of the ship. And this idea of social class as cabin class is not idiosyncratic, because I think we all appreciate that that's highly correlated with socioeconomic status. That is, the property elite had the best suites at the top of the ship. They survived at greater rates, male and female. Whereas what we'll call the working class, the proletariat, whatever words you want to have at that time, especially measured by the way they spoke about things, it was those who were at risk in the lower regions of the Titanic that had huge mortality rates in contrast to their upper class cabins. So the data's there. We already see it in that visualization to the right. But how about if we visualize the data in a different way so the story can be told in a moment? And here it is. Now, I don't want people to agonize over whether you can read the font. What I want you to appreciate at this point in the presentation, the preface, is that by using data visualization, we can capture a storyline in much more effective fashion. The white zone, first class. From left to right, that's the age distribution. How many people survived at each age? And as you go further to the right, to the third campus, there's a much smaller proportion of survival and a much more clustered mortality rate if you look at the black to the bottom of what age group died in the process in the third class cabins. So that sets our stage and leads us now to a brief consideration of the relevant theory that will inform our work on how do we manage up through grid, how do we lead across and up through group. And I'm trained as a political economist and as a social psychologist. They were my field studies, my area exams in my PhD program. And indeed, these ideas of grid and group, the institutional versus the interpersonal, are common to all complex systems, whether higher education or healthcare, the military or government. All complex systems have to navigate social forces of grid, institution, or group, other people. Now, secondly, then, we can start to apply this model in a more granular way. And that's through the notion of the social ecology of that particular sector. I've illustrated here higher education because that's the place that Suzanne and I work. But you could simply substitute the word higher education for healthcare. And instead of academic, you say clinical. Instead of learning, you say healing, because that's the outcome. If higher ed outcome is learning, healthcare outcome is healing. And you'll see that reflected later on in this presentation, that again, this model is highly adaptable. It can be applied to any sector of society. The same principles will apply. Now, a cursory reading, even much less a deep one, of the management and leadership theory as manifest in the professional and the public press really shows that there are three paradigms that evolved more or less concurrently, but over time privileged a different kind of focus for business leaders, business broadly defined, whether healthcare, higher education, and so on. And again, don't be so wed or enamored with the detail on the page. There's a lot here. And as I go through the next few slides, there will also be a lot related to the particular theoretical paradigms and the founders of them that speak to this. Think of structure as grid. You work up and down or across the hierarchy through formally defined channels. Your power base as a supervisor is stronger from a formal authority perspective than the power base of the people who report to you. In some sense, your peers, the notion of peer, means you have equivalent power, but it's in a different office of record. In this paradigm, the focus is on the individual and the attributes of the individual as a manager or a leader, and the improvement of their own personal capital in fulfilling either task-related or people-related work. Now, secondly, what we'll see in a moment is that the second paradigm is evident in the first, no question, but really came into its fore a couple decades after the business theory paradigm. And instead of focused on management as positional power, structural, functional, it really emphasizes the importance of leadership as relational power. So this again speaks directly to our title. How do we move managing up from its space in the business aspect of formal authority to leading up, which might capitalize on relational power, cultural relational power, anywhere within the institution across formal power lines. And in this case, what I want you to appreciate, when we've already moved the second paradigm, we see that power, management, leadership, it has collective, not just individual attributes. It's not simply about the skills of the person. You don't have a manager if there's no one reporting to that manager. You don't have a leader if no one is following the leader. If I were to give this presentation and no one was here to attend it and I talked the whole time, did I really say anything? Because there was no audience. So in this case, think of the second paradigm as really understanding the way in which we leverage relational power through leadership across formal lines for, in this case, the objective to improve social capital, not simply personal capital. And then finally, although it was there, indeed, most of the founders of my discipline and everything broadly encompassed by the nature of, the social or behavioral sciences had already been working with Charles Darwin's work, right? The unnatural selection. And ecology theory from many other places as well really developed out of this emphasis that the organism or the organization, both of which have the root word organ, which is something in our body, applies as well to complex systems. And in this case, those systems have to interface with their external environment. They have to adapt to that environment or they won't survive. So now the manifest objective has switched even beyond internal social capital to improvement of organizational capital for the sake of organizational survival. And in a moment, you'll see what that means in terms of measurement. The first being fairly obvious. We won't go into any of this in detail, but it's the easiest to document as a paradigm. It really reflects the rise of psychology and clinical psychiatry in the United States. Everything from Galton on the far right, a father eugenics, not good, to Alfred Binet, who you may know in the early 1900s was asked by the French government to separate kids, those ready for normal school, that's where the concept comes from, versus those that needed remedial education. He was the first to develop a practical IQ test. And indeed, it led to a proliferation of work. Thorndike, you'll see here, for example, is credited with developing some of the early, what they called manpower at the time, but working with business communities to develop screening forms to assess whether they were recruiting the person that was the overall best fit for a scripted role in a formal hierarchy. Now, in counter to that, and indeed even as inspired through Peter Drucker in particular, the recognized founder of business theory in this country, we already have the elements evident for social capital and ecological capital analysis. But as the speech here proceeds, because then we'll go to a more Socratic method toward the end of the talk, these four individuals I've singled out as fundamental to our understanding of how all three paradigms of individual accountability, social capital, and ecological survival come into play. First of all, Peter Drucker. He identified in his work, this is all coming about, as you see, in the 70s, based on the turn of the country after World War II into a service economy, where manufacturing was no longer the predominant share of work in society. Instead, he coined what he called the knowledge worker. And in his paradigm, he emphasized that knowledge workers can't survive just on the grid, just on industrial management, which used to literally mean the owners and the workers. But along comes this new thing called the manager. And the manager, or what he later on called the effective executive, must be equally facile in relational work as they are in the work of authority. And one way to think about this is managers tell you what to do, leaders show you what to do. And in doing so, this theorist, very influential, again, considered the founder of modern business theory, emphasized that organizations must do three things. One, they got to do their internal business. Who are you? Are you a business, a hospital, a university? And by the way, this is verbatim from Drucker, and many of these slides are. Secondly, it's that social bucket. How in working with each other do we make work productive? Do we make work, quote, achieving in his words? That is, the individual does not exist in a vacuum. They have to work with others to get things done and be productive. And then finally, as we'll see later on in the talk, how do you manage your social impact and your social responsibility, which is an emphasis that was clearly tied to the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, and indeed really reflected that in Drucker's model, effective executives have to attend to business, social, and moral imperatives. This work was reinforced by one of the leading social theorists now, instead of business theorists at the time, Daniel Bell. His book was fundamental and forecast, because his subtitle is A Venture in Social Forecasting. He accurately predicted the way in which the contours of society itself would change over time. And he emphasized, again, this move from a manufacturing economy to a consumption economy where intellectual property and the university now displace the corporate and business sector as the main seat of society. And the idea then that we would make decisions based on the need of people rather than on politicized values. I'll talk about that more later. Now, finally, in rounding out how this gridding group happened and the turn to the really social network phase, there's a lot here. Don't worry about reading it. I want you to focus on that diagram on the left, because the genius of Jacob Marino, a founder of psychodrama, which was to role play trauma so that you could relieve yourself of that, because I think many of us appreciate psychoanalytic theory, is based on the notion that we have unresolved trauma. And Freud himself situated that as sexual trauma in particular, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be any manner of trauma. And Marino developed these social scripted role plays to be able to allow people to express the otherwise unrecognized or unexpressed trauma. And when he did so, he hit upon a noble method, an innovative method that is, called sociometry, where he had been asked to consult at this Hudson School for Girls, and they had a huge spike in girls fleeing the school. And so he just sat down with different girls and he said, who do you like? Who do you hang out with? He mapped that out. And as this diagram shows, some people are deeply connected even across their little subcultures. Others are isolated. See the two at the top left? that one on the far left only has one person they like or work with. So they're completely isolated relative to everyone else who has multiple social touch points. This method of sociometry, in contrast to the psychometric measure of the individual, you're looking at the social network, has been applied in multiple arenas. And I won't have a chance to show you these video clips, but there's a couple of commercials that one of the insurance company has, Capital, where they have a baseball team, a bunch of kids, and he asks for Derek Jeter. Well, this kid stands up and he says, no, I meant the other Derek, which is the baseball phenom. And then they do that in a little basketball pickup game with kids where Charles Barkley is picked to be on the side, right? These are the highly chosen. And he thumbs his nose at the kid who wasn't chosen. Comical. If we have time, we can double that. But in the interest of time, I'll round out the conversation by talking about that third paradigm, and then we'll turn to a couple of toolkit examples, and finally our case study from Susanna. So, third paradigm, it's easy to see organization as a structure of cause and effect, parts, this kind of structural, anatomy, if you will. Instead, he argues we're too complex as creatures to apply that. Indeed, all species are. So this is a paradigm shift. And what this business theorist, as it turns out, Gareth Morgan explained, is we act according to our definition of a situation. So while formal structure authorities emphasize that we act because we were told to do something, this paradigm that Morgan offers of social constructionism says we have to define the organization, and the way we view it determines the way we behave within it. And indeed, at the bottom, you can see all the different metaphors that he found through his research. Today, we're only privileging a few: the organization as machine, formal authority; the organization as culture, you'll see that in a moment, social network; and the organization as ecology, right? Open to their environment in order to survive. So this is illustrated now, and this is where we'll return to the notion of data visualization as opposed to just data tabulation. This book by Childress is quite interesting. He uses the metaphor of spider webs to characterize the cultural domain, the relational domain. And indeed, spider webs are very complex architectures that are designed to capture prey and conversely, protect the spider from predators because they live below their web and no one can get to them because of the tensile, because of the stickiness, if you will. And so the spiders, to quote Drucker again, he used to talk about structure follows strategy. Well, if the strategy is to capture prey and avoid being captured by prey, this structure works. I want to end this segment of the theory by noting one application of this idea of building sustainable, adaptable structures is multi-campus digital library systems, which allow you to reduce the costs of production and extend the breadth of consumption without creating adverse ecological harm. So when you hear about all of these carbon scorecards and so on, they're speaking to the same issue. How can we redesign production and consumption systems so we can create a sustainable planet? And I want to close the theory part by the quotes on the left. What gets measured gets managed, Drucker's first insight. And he says in the end, doesn't matter what your strat plan is or what your structure is, as soon as people go to the water cooler, culture eats strategy for breakfast. People just do what they think they want to do anyway, no matter what the formal organization. So we may know that Peter Drucker coined a lot of the phrases that we take for granted. Management by objective, SWOT analyses, they'll all come from Drucker. He was the innovator of these concepts. So then quickly, and indeed, you will all have a PDF of this presentation, so you can apply these to your own organizations. I'm going to give you 5 examples of tools you can use to look at particular organizations and particular products within that organization, that is particular tasks. So I think this is probably the most well-known psychometric model on personal development based on Maslow. People call it the hierarchy of needs. He never talked about a hierarchy. You could do a data visualization like the bottom and yet have the same source data to understand how these comfort zones, right, stack on each other, leading to self-actualization as the goal, But if your stomach is empty, if you don't have housing in that base physiological area, like many of our students and many of our patients are threatened with housing and food insecurity, you're in trouble. So you can start by asking your colleagues and self, tell me about where you're at on Maslow's hierarchy. Are you feeling comfortable? Are you working on it? Or are you really feeling, vulnerable or at risk? And how do we get to that peace of mind across all of these domains? Secondly, John Maxwell is probably the most published. He's very good at taking the same idea and repackaging, I'll put it that way, 15 ways. Each time he comes out with a new book, I assure you, it's the same thing. That's not pejorative. It's just recognizing that you get one book, you get all books. But look at how he tiers, and he does use a pyramid. He really, in a way, says the same thing as Maslow, but now is really thinking about the individual in an organizational context. And this is very clear, as well as Childress previously, that positional power, formal power is the weakest power. If you have to tell someone to do something, you've already lost. If they understand through their relational work and they're trusting you as a leader, they will figure out what to do of their own accord and they will get it done. And to the extent then that you build reputation with others, the social network, you now have moved up the pyramid to the pinnacle, which is self-actualization as a leader. Now, in contrast, and here's where we're going to go a little bit, creative now with a little Q&A with Susanna to illustrate what this means in real time. So Susanna, please join the conversation now. And just tell us, we saw the org chart earlier, what functional offices in the grid of CDU do you have to work with?
So hello, everybody. So for me, when we talk about grid, I think about offices like our registration office, our registrar's office, our financial aid office. I think of different programs within our colleges that we have at CDU. I also think of student services and student support that I can provide that information for them, or we work together in a grid.
So is there an example where outside of grid you have a group, right? Do you have mentors, role models, extra contacts where
I
that's
do.
cultural? Yes, tell us about that.
So I do, like all of you as well in public health, myself in institutional research and academic effectiveness. My groups are the organizations that support us, that prepare us for that. So I'm part of the WASC organization, which is the Western Associations of Schools and Colleges. I'm also part of CARE, which is the California Association of Institutional Researchers. And these are my groups, these are my networks, right? Where I can reach out to these individual colleagues that are at my same professional level. So when we begin to discuss ideas about moving forward or how to better do a product that we need to report on.
Thank you. And to further illustrate this, as Dr. Santos was just mentioning then, there is a whole variety of stakeholder and what they call matrix management models. So simple hierarchy says, I'm the boss, I give you an order, you do it. Social network analysis says, hey, I have to work across functionally because I can't do it alone. I have to talk to this other office of record. Now, stakeholders can be internal or external. So to the left, you have a project management stakeholder model where you're working cross-functionally on a particular project. There are lots of theoretical and conceptual paradigms about the relative powers and the relative interests. So imagine what this is telling you, right? If a person has high power and high interest, you got to manage that relationship closely because you have a lot to lose if you don't get it right. And then below is an idea of how you can build out your strategic plan around engagement of different stakeholders. And what I want to emphasize by providing the definition of stakes is we often take language for granted, but language evolved literally over centuries. And to plant stakes in an organization is mean you have a vested interest in the outcome. And your interest may be financial, or it may even be reputational. Reputational with the idea that I put my reputation on the line to say CDU is the right school to go to, or Cedars-Sinai or Kaiser are the right hospital, or MLK OPC, so on and so forth. So that's merely to say that now what we've done as a unit is we've developed these ideas and started to say, how can we get beyond an idea and a data tabulation to a data visualization? So this last part, in again defining ecology, the external adaptability and survivability, this one on the left, it's a digital library image, and it really evokes for me, you can't capture data. It's going up, down, sideways, in real time, all the time. There's no such thing as point A and point B stimulus response. And then finally to the right, it's one of my favorite graphics of all time, because at a glance, I can see financial flows. I know where the big buckets of incoming money are. I know what I'm spending them on, and I know what the intersection of each of those different lanes are involved in terms of the wider ecology. So again, you will have this after the presentation. So now what we're going to do over a few minutes time is we're going to talk very quickly about the 3 applications, and then we're going to pivot to a few implications and then open up the floor to Q&A. So Susanna, we've got 3 tasks on the right, and we're going to treat them in turn. The first task involves student data, and it involves a hierarchical management model where my boss said, and I said to you, we've got to do this work getting student data consolidated. The second involves faculty data as the object of analysis. And in that case, we had to reach across organizational lines because we had different systems of record under the control of different divisions. And then finally, the heart of this talk, in a way, is how do we deploy technology so that we can effectively manage and lead up with data. So Susanna, take a minute or so for each of these just to give us a few thoughts about what were the challenges and what were the solutions for the student as the unit of analysis.
Well, for the first part, as you can see on your on the slide, right, we have student data, right? In your case, maybe you would have patient data, right? So they're different people, but they're the same person. And in this situation, we needed to do kind of a leading up type of process. And we were looking at student information and how best to provide a report, moving forward. And so there was this of kind of working within a group of people, right? We need to produce this amount of information. For example, for us, we have a lot of external reporting that we need to do. So how do we consolidate the student information, right? For our annual reporting, right? And also for internal purposes. And so I really had to work with colleagues within my division, but we were kind of moving up in a direction, right? And so we were trying to come together so that we could be able to support our leadership. But it's more of a hierarchical management, right? It's a middle management kind of. We go from middle to top, and so that's really that interpersonal, hierarchical management model.
Secondly, when the faculty is the unit of analysis, what was the main challenge set there in terms of this particular object of interest?
So for this part, it's what Dr. Shea talks about leading across, right? And what we had to do here is we had to work with different offices, different departments across the institution, people that had access to different information. We, for example, in this situation, we have our faculty data, but it sits in different, different systems, right? You probably have patient data, right? And certain information sits in one system while other information sits in another. In order for you to be able to report this out, this is more of a matrix management model, right? You're going to work across your institution, your office, your company, to be able to produce informations and reports that need to be done.
And then finally now, and this is an issue of scaling analysis up. If the first 2 examples had individual level, this has aggregate program level. So Susanna, what was the particular twist here as we scale data up, and especially as we apply technology to that challenge?
So here we really saw we had to deploy technology for storytelling, and we all have to tell a story. Even you yourself in public health, you have to be able to tell a story. You have all this information on your clients, on your patients, but you need to be able to tell a story. You need to be able to keep their individual information private, and that's what we mean by telling a story. So it's a story. You don't go into the really details of who the person is, Jane Doe, male, female. No, you just kind of say we have 20% female, we have 10% male. And so this is really about using technology like Power BI enabled to allow us to produce a story. In this situation, we use Power BI to work with one of our programs, right? And so it allowed us to help them tell a story to external reporting, in this case, to their stakeholders, to their accrediting agencies. And so it was a wonderful opportunity that allowed them to have ownership of the data, because now we had all of their data in a way that they could then be able to use slicers or change certain information around to look at specific groups or cohorts of individuals. So it allowed them to tell a story without looking at the individual student. We would be able to protect that individual identity.
Thank you, Susanna. I really appreciate those anecdotes illustrating how this worked in real time. And what we're going to do now is pivot to the close and talk a little bit about the hazards of data. This is a simple illustration. We went back and constructed a file since fall 2016 of every student, even if they were only here for an instant. And you'll see here that that's over 3,300 students. And we were looking to see, are there any differentials in their outcomes as either continuing, they're going on to the next term, having graduated as their last data point, having been on leave as their last data point, or having withdrawn. And to the left, you see there really are no sex differences, that each of these four statuses, females and males are proportionally likely in terms of their share of those in one of those four outcomes. Now, however, when you look to the right on race ethnicity, I'll point out in particular the differentials between African American students and Asian students. So Asian students are more likely, disproportionately, to have graduated, if you will, relative to their overall, and African American students less in that graduation bucket. In contrast, on leave and withdrawn, look at the spikes, disproportionate spikes, where of all the students on leave, which is not a lot, 29, but all the students who withdraw, 400 over that whole time frame out of 3,300, that African American students comprise a disproportionate share of those who withdrew. Now, here's where we get into trouble. And I mean that good trouble in a way, because it allows us to unpack the attributions that we make surrounding data. So in the end, and then we're going to open up for question, I'm going to go very fast, because you can return to this later, and we can indeed have workshops that would be a full 3 hours on each of these instances. Simone de Beauvoir, one of the founders of the French existentialist and resistance movements during World War II, along with Camus and Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre, her, I'll call it non-married spouse, if you will. They were famous for rejecting marriage as a compact that one should never strike. They were instrumental in articulating this notion that it doesn't matter if we're talking about sex, gender, or race ethnicity. People aren't born to be a woman. They aren't born to be Black. They come to learn that that's what someone else calls them. And when we do that, and when we use data to describe that, we run huge risks. And indeed, we are at a turning point. The Civil Rights Act, the Higher Education Act, all coming out of the turmoil of the 60s, is being dismantled in real time. And these three court cases, California back in the day with Prop 209, Dobbs overturning a woman's right to abortion, and the recent Supreme Court decision on not being able to use race-based factors or, quote, affirmative action, unquote, for admission purposes, are changing the landscape in real time. The person who's probably most instrumental in articulating what it means to racialize the other is W.E.B. Du Bois. And we won't have much time, but he really makes the point that three things can happen. We can fix on this color of skin, quote, as race, and draw all sorts of inferences about what being Black or white is. And Frantz Fanon described this as Black skin with white masks. And indeed, W.B. himself said that people of color live behind the veil. Those that are white live beyond or without, but they don't even know it. Secondly, you can have ethnographic racialization, where you appropriate the culture of the race of the other, race again as a problematic term. And then finally, there's a whole literature on the unequal distribution of ecological benefit in farm, harm that is that systems ecology issue. The best example is cited below, the soils, right, of Black folk, where Black folk, either as slaves or now as emancipated other, were blamed because they polluted or soiled the ground such that it was no longer productive. So see how quickly we can go from an attribution of race to an attribution of something very negative. So finally, this can all be situated again in a context of Marxian theory. Don't be thrown by that. It turns out there's a lot of people who speak Marxism without knowing it. And he pointed out that we have alienated labor. You're alienated from your process, your product. You saw it in the charts earlier, from each other's and from our nature as productive beings. That when we fetishize something, we deify it. We think that thing has supernatural powers. And third, we risk humanizing data. Oh, there's a little earthquake, folks, not just a little one. Oh boy, still going, still going. Sorry for
I'm
the
sorry to interrupt. There's an earthquake.
Yep, exactly. In real time, it's still going.
Okay. I'm so sorry.
Well, you can't apologize for Mother Nature. But wow, that's pretty impressive. Okay, I must have said something that rang true. Don't fetishize and think that data is deified, because I guarantee you that whatever just happened doesn't have to do with data. Okay, so what we're doing is I'm going to note that applying this again to healthcare, race is a highly contested concept. And on the left, we see they want to dispel with race altogether. They, in their minds, these researchers in the Journal of Nursing say this is a misguided idea. There's other literature that says use ancestry instead of race. And indeed, you see that echoed here on the right. Let's be a little more cautious. Don't throw out the baby data with the bathwater data. And then finally, the cautionary tales. If we don't measure it, it's not real. And when we measure it, we might mismeasure it. And when we measure it, we might misinterpret it because we have deified the data. We've humanized the data when it has no such thing. And it brings us full circle to our opening clip on artificial intelligence, which a lot of people are saying artificial intelligence can think for itself. I'm going to contend, no, it can't. And that the only creature on the planet, broadly defined, machine or organic, that can make meaning is a human. Machines are good at tabulating, they're good at visualizing, but they can't make the meaning that we uniquely can do. So with that, we have the credits for our paper divided by the sections, theory, application, the case study in the case of CDU. If you've never read the McComb Commission report on the rebellion in Watts that led to the founding of our institution, you'll have some citations to do that. It's fascinating, and it's not without criticism because the McComb Commission was white, writing about a Black community. Let's just put it frankly. So finally then, with cautionary tales, this is where we're landing. And I'm going to ask Susanna to encapsulate in just a minute. So we turn the tables back to you all. Hopefully no one had a problem with that earthquake. That Susanna, in closing out our presentation, tell us a little bit about how this whole model felt early on. Not what you thought about it, but how it felt when I first presented it 9 months ago. And then where do you think we need to go now with the practical application of this method?
So for me, as I think about it, I think that we were talking two different languages, right? We still had this, we wanted the same thing, but we weren't able to communicate with each other. It's like when you're in another country, right? And maybe you're at a restaurant and you're trying to order something, and you can't seem to be able to communicate with them and tell them what you want and what you need. So you kind of begin to draw things out, right? So that you can kind of see, okay, this is what I mean. Does this make sense to you? Do you get it? And that's where really Dr. Shea's piece about the spiderweb started to kind of make sense to me, because he was telling a story, and he was telling a story with images. And that's what we're using technology for now, is to tell a story, because we all speak different languages in a sense in a professional setting, right? In public health, you use different terminologies that we use in higher education, but we're all trying to say the same thing. So we use technology to help tell the story, to create a common data dictionary that's what I call it. I say data dictionary. And where we're going is we're hoping to expand Power BI to other programs so that they're able to tell a story together and we're able to communicate together. And that's what we're going to do with Dr. Shea as kind of, overseeing our department. We have Samuel Pendar here as well, who is instrumental in this. And we have Dr. Zhang as well, who her information and support has also been really valid. So that's kind of where we see our team kind of going, is to continue to tell the story in other departments and programs.
Thank you. That rounds out our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing at this point so I get a feel for the context of the audience as well. And what we intend to do here now in closing is to open up the floor. And I've asked Jennifer and Claudia to track the chat. And there may be a question in there or not. It's like, why is the building shaking? What Suzanne and Bill were talking about wasn't that earth shaking. But I don't think I've ever been in a live proceeding when an earthquake happens. But let's start with any comments or questions as we close out this segment. Time flies. I would love opportunities from any of your organizations where we'll take this on the road. We'll come with you and we'll not only present this, we'll actually go deep and apply that toolkit to your practical project examples. Because if it just lives in our head and we don't put it into practice, it ain't real. So with that, thank you, everyone, and back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Bill, for this entire presentation. Susana, thanks for giving like your own experience too and how the past 9 months has rolled out and really implementing it. Whether you feel comfortable just typing your question in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask directly, feel free, especially if you're trying to think through where you are currently working at and how this is applicable. We do have a couple minutes to go through that. And yeah, we all experienced an earthquake.
Jen,
So I don't know where everyone feels.
sorry, Jen, I think the earthquake does something to your computer, but there's an echo.
A double mic, I think. Yeah,
Double mic.
we'll fix that. Floor is open, please. And I know actually quite a few of the names here one way or another, so don't be shy.
I don't see anything in the chat, Dr. Shea.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody?
Are you saying you're looking at the chat, Claudia?
Yes, but I don't see we don't have any questions.
All right. Sandoz, do you have any thoughts as chair of the department?
Thank you, Dr. Shea. Thank you, Dr. Santos. Really, it's an amazing presentation. And I'm like, wow, I should call you guys into one of our MPH classes because we do cover data visualization. Another class covers the complex systems and leadership and managers. So, but thank you. A great presentation of incorporating all these into one presentation. I hope it was helpful to everybody who attended. It was very helpful to me. And you might hear from me, Dr. Shea and Dr. Santos. It's like, would you like to guest lecture?
There you go.
Because this is very important for public health professionals and our students to know, before getting into the workforce. They need to be aware and very comfortable, especially with data visualization. Yeah, and also we touched with the visualization. It helps to have that contact reach lay audiences, community members. You get a lot of presentations usually with our MPH students and even undergraduate students, where their presentations are targeted towards health professionals. But we need more about data visualization for the lay audience. That's sorry, right. My camera, I don't know why I'm calling here. There's
no, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Covered. I'm sorry. So yes, I think it was very helpful. Thank you very much. And if anybody has
well, let me make one comment, and thank you, because this is clearly no good deed goes unpunished. Now you're going to put us to work again, but that's why we're here. Secondly, I noticed one thread that when I was talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, and his book is The Souls of Black Folk, and there's an article called The Soils of Black Folk, because it's really a precursor to modern, ecological theory of racialized outcomes. And so it actually is a study of some of the chapters in various works of WEDB that talk about the way in which in post-emancipation America, and even ever since now, that Blacks are blamed as tillers of the soil for the soil no longer being productive. And it really reinforces things that were implicit in his work that have now been drawn out into these three cautionary tales, right? About the demographics of race, the ethnographics of race, and the geographics of race. And if there's one thought I'd like to leave you with today, is that I construe the notion of ancestry as about all three of those. If race is about being male, female, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever the terms are, then we can move beyond that to understand that the label is not the person, and that ancestry is a much more broader concept than race and can take into account country of origin and place of origin by extension. So it's an exciting opportunity for all of us to think about the way in which data can help, but also mislead. So we have 2 minutes. Anyone else want to take a nibble at something? And in other words, as well as Dr. Islam is emphasizing, invite us back. We're willing to put the show on the road.
I guess that's it. Dr.
Wonderful.
Shea, Dr. Santos, thank you so much for your time. I know how busy you are, really appreciate it. And yes, I might call on you. So yes,
There you go.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone. I'm going to open my door and see if anything happened in the Rumble. It lasted about 15 seconds. That's longer than normal.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.